Welcome to Real Talk in ELT, a podcast that talks about the reality of teaching English.
Welcome back to another episode of Real Talk in ELT. I am here by myself today, and I am going to update or give today's episode is going to be another summaries and side notes. So I just finished maybe 15 minutes ago. I'm trying to stay on top of things now. I just finished attending a Conversations in BELF meeting. They had Professor Kurt Kohn, who was there, and he's wonderful. Kohn, I think it's Kohn, Kohn. He's German. Wonderful speaker, very, very well-researched presentation. And he was talking about really kind of this new perspective. I'm going to put perspective. They said mindset. I don't like the word mindset, but perspective of how to approach a BELF classroom in terms of the teaching practices and what you want to include. So I'm going to be looking off to the side here because I have my notes there. But let me give you the overall summary of his talk. I joined... I was 3 minutes late, so I missed the introduction. I always miss the introductions. To be fair, it's early on a Saturday morning, and I have to kind of get the house all set and everything going before I can log in. And I tried to log in on time, but I always miss the first couple minutes. Anyways, he jumped into the ideas of developing speaker learners' BELF competence for authentic BELF communication. Now, he did say that he likes to clarify lots of things in terms of terminology. So speaker learner, because while we are speaking, we are also learning. And I would say that is actually quite apt for native and non-native speakers. I know that we still have these distinctions between native and non-native speakers, but there's a lot of times that I'm still learning things when I listen to certain people talk or just kind of have to make these adjustments, or maybe it falls under the category of accommodation theory. But I think speaker learners is like a really apt way of describing people who are using English in various situations. So he went through the ideas of authenticity and how it's a little deceptive sometimes because authentic things and genuine things can be different. And he quoted Widdowson on that, and that pedagogical... Hang on, let me just make my notes bigger because I'm getting old, people. Okay, so pedagogical interventions would be making things authentic for your students, meaning authentic. They are authenticating things in terms of asking them what real situations they get themselves into. Now, he was approaching this from a BELF perspective because the group that puts on these is Conversations in BELF. So we are all usually educators or people who deal with business English, but you can see how the application, I mean, this is just kind of in general, right? So we're focused here on business English because of the group that everybody's participating in, but this can be expanded out for sure, in my opinion. Anyways, so talking to the students and having them kind of creating or developing their own, developing their own language, but also developing the scenarios in which the teacher is working and constructing the classes and the materials and everything. So there's a common feature of authenticated BELF communication is that there's communicative surprises. Now, in addition to this episode, I'm going to record another episode of a case study that it perfectly exemplifies a communicative surprise that happened with one of my students. And this is why I found it so interesting, and I really wanted to participate in his talk because the connection between them is not far-fetched, and this is not, this is general theory. It's, yes, this happens all the time. It's the idea that when you teach your students something and then they go off and do whatever they're going to do, travel, work, etc., and then they come back and they say, so that was nothing like we practiced. because I'm sure almost every English language teacher has encountered that at some point in their career, because we follow the current models, we follow the current methodologies, we do things according to standards, whatever standards they might be, whatever institutions you might be working at or training at, or et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes that doesn't account for communicative surprises. So he went into communicative surprises when nothing turns out as it was practiced or expected. The speaker learners are forced to go beyond their tried and trusted repertoires and routines. So we practice with them, and they go over it, we go over it again, and we go over it again, and then and then they get into the situation where they actually have to use their English, and it's nothing like what we practice. So what is left? They have their English repertoire, what we've built up in terms of proficiency, what they have as a foundation, whatever they have in their brains, their natural capability for communication. Some people are really good communicators and can kind of get around things, and some people are terrible at communication, so we have to practice those skills as well. So communication skills, top of the list. And their sense of agency and emancipation. So this is, he answers 3 questions in his talk. And the first question is, what is the nature of sorry, I'm still sick. I've been sick for weeks, and you can see like I have like red marks because I've just been coughing, and my skin is just like so irritated because so much force has been, yeah, anyways. Okay. I apologize. Divergent back into the thing. So key questions. The first one was, what is the nature of speaker learners' capability for communication, and how can it help them cope with surprises in authentic BELF communication? BELF, ELF, I mean, applicable in both areas, so use it as you wish. This is not limited to business English, but we focused on business English. So, so to answer that, he talked about pragmatic creativity and virtual English. Virtual English, I still, I'm a little fuzzy on that. I might actually try to get Professor Kohn to come onto the podcast because he's brilliant. I've really thoroughly enjoyed his talk, and the way that he explains things is very, it's very easy to understand, even though he's talking about things that are relatively complex at times. You can still follow the conversation. So let's hope that maybe he'll come on and talk to me. So pragmatic creativity. And then he goes on to quote a few people here, Widdowson, and then Widdowson and Seidhofer. Seidhofer. I'm probably saying that wrong. Anyways, so he uses a couple quotes. So the first one is from Widdowson. In all uses of the language, we find innovative grammatical and lexical expressions, variable encodings that are not sanctioned by established convention, that exploit the hitherto unexplored possibilities in what I have referred to, I meaning Widdowson, have referred to as virtual language. And then Widdowson and Seidhofer said incompetent users of English can be capable communicators, and indeed their capability in many ways depends on their incompetence. So because they don't have what they need, they become very capable communicators because they have to find another way. So one of the things he tried to clarify was the idea of virtual English, that it's not a given repertoire. It's not something that you have. It's something that's like English in the making or English on the move. Those are what he called it. And so it's kind of this weird, uncharted space that you just are trying to navigate through. And because this virtual English, this weird space emerges, speakers, learners, strategic deployment of their pragmatic creativity then can give them a little bit of the ability to navigate those situations, but they have to be able to trust their agency and emancipation. And this is what he focuses on at the end. So they need to, right now, the current model, as Professor says, the current model of orientation and guidance is on intelligibility. But intelligibility is not the end-all, be-all. They have to be intelligible, of course, but also there are some personal requirements of communicative and communal success because we're talking to people, right? People, it's a messy situation. So what he says is that the speaker also needs to be satisfied with their ability to perform. I'm going to use that, to perform in certain situations. So he breaks that down into, what do the speaker learners want to be? Meaning, are they satisfied with their performance? But what does that mean? Like, what are they trying to achieve here? And some of the things that he pointed out were express meanings and intentions, be understood, understand others, and be professional, because we're talking about business English, but also be, a good citizen if you were talking about general English. He also adds, which I think is like the majority of the people, right? So like everybody just wants to express their intentions, be understood, and understand others, and just kind of blend into whatever social construct that they have there. So if they need to be professional because they're working with other people, or if they need to, just kind of be a normal human and be able to interact. He also included to speak like members of a certain community. This specifically applies when we're talking about business English, because you want to be a part of that community. It helps with building rapport, building relationships. We know that businesses nowadays, it's not so much about transactions. It's more about building relationships and being able to maintain relationships to negotiate business and to have successful businesses. Engage in translanguaging within and beyond their English. So be able to navigate that kind of situation, and be cooperative, empathetic. And so it's more than just being intelligible. We also have to look at this idea that this communication events are happening in social situations. And depending on those social situations, the speaker has to be satisfied with their performance and how they come off in those scenarios. Following so far. So then we went into, again, I say we, you know what I mean. You've listened to me long enough. Professor Kohn went into speaker learners' capability for communication. So there's some key qualities that help with BELF surprises. And so two of them were pragmatic creativity and strategic processing. Which we kind of looked at there. And then we have contextual inferencing in comprehension and production, and expressing one's thoughts when speaking and writing. So contextual inferencing between comprehension and production, he's divided into kind of like two columns here. And comprehension is understanding more than what is explicitly said. And production is that the audience modeling concerning available repertoire and contextual inferencing capability. Meaning that he did give an example of this. So if you say, if there was a question from, this is from Blakemore, and it's called, the reference is called Understanding Utterances, and it says, "Did you enjoy your holiday? The beaches were crowded and the hotel was full of bugs." And so he went into Wilson and Sperber's work in relevance in communication and cognition, and talked about explicatures and implicatures, meaning you have to understand the context and the background knowledge. So the beaches were crowded. What beaches? Well, if you're having a conversation with a person and you're asking them about their holiday, then you can obviously reference what the specific beaches they're talking about, the ones that were on the holiday. And if they were crowded, he's probably talking about either people that live there or tourists, or I'm assuming if it's a holiday, maybe it's a holiday season, so then there's going to be lots of tourists. And the hotel is full of bugs. Well, what kind of bugs are they talking about? Are they talking about insects? Are they talking about recording devices? Exactly. So this is kind of the idea of context and background knowledge. So explicatures is being able to understand that, and the implicatures is didn't really like it. Wasn't great. That's what I'm getting from what the person said. So there's a couple strategic comprehension and production processing things that happen there in terms of co-construction, handling misunderstandings, a little bit of accommodation. So what he said was that when we're expressing our thoughts, it's gradual, which is true, and partly chaotic in its emergence, because the intended meaning when we're speaking, when we're writing, it's kind of developing. Just like, for example, I'm sitting here and I'm podcasting, right? And I'm trying to give you a summary of Professor Kohn's work and the presentation that he gave. And as I'm doing this, you can actually hear, listening to me, this is a very gradual, I'm going through my repertoire, trying to construct things that I think the audience members, so whoever's listening to me, is going to be able to comprehend and also engage with and understand the context, understand the background. And it's very chaotic because I use a lot of ums and ahs, and I repeat words frequently because I'm trying to construct this. And so because I'm doing this unscripted, without any preparation, and these summaries and side notes episodes are very much, this is what I saw, and here's my immediate reaction of some professional development that I'm engaged in. You can see that my expressing my thoughts is gradual, and the emergence of it is very chaotic. It's not a clear stream of thoughts. And even this happens in writing. But what happens in writing is that we look at the product of our writing, and it's beautiful and concise, and it makes sense, and it follows some sort of rules for communication purposes and intelligibility. But we're looking at the product. The process of putting that together is also gradual and has chaotic emergence, like he said. So we have to kind of take into consideration that happens. And so because of that, we have to be comfortable with knowing that we have comprehension, we have production that is going on, we have these contextual inferencing, so people are trying to understand while they're engaging with the content. So a lot happening. Then we go back to some of the key qualities, and the last three that he put on the board were cooperativity with your attitude and behavior, communication monitoring, and empathetic rapport. So being able to, he says that BELF competence is being able to make best use, BELF competence for him is being able to make best use of one's BELF repertoire and communicative capability in BELF communication when faced with BELF surprises. So there's a lot of, to have communicative capability, there's a lot of components that go in there. So the components that he highlights, I'm just going back and recapping, is pragmatic creativity, being able to kind of make it your own, strategic processing, contextual inferencing in comprehension and in production, expressing one's thoughts when speaking and writing, cooperativity with your attitude and behavior, obviously with the people that you're interacting with, communication monitoring, and empathetic rapport. So all of those things go into this communicative capability. So there's a lot that's happening, and there's a lot that's like processing. So answering his second question, let me read the second question to you. So that was the first question. What is the nature of speaker learners' capability for communication, and how can it help them cope with surprises? So there's a lot of things going on, and that being able to kind of manage all of those key characteristics can help them cope with surprises in authentic communication. The second question that he tackles is BELT, business English language teaching, BELT English's preference for standard English in conflict with successful BELF communication? Well, hang on. Let me go back down to my notes here. So there's a critique of English language teaching from the general English ELF perspective, is that this one is from Rose, McKinley, and Galloway, that the global spread of English calls for a paradigm shift in TESOL curricula to address the mismatch between what is taught in the classroom and how English functions in the classroom, outside the classroom, And there's, of course, this ELF awareness movement. I've had lots of people on the podcast talking about ELF, English as a lingua franca. So if you're unfamiliar with it, please feel free to go back and reference those episodes. But what ELF users, and this comes from Sifakis, I think it's Nicola, I forget, but yeah, Sifakis. What ELF users know and how they interact should inform lesson plans, teacher training curricula, textbooks, policies, and assessment procedures in a way that will render the ELT experience richer and deeper and closer to a realistic experience of what has come to be global communication via English. So he mentions the Enrich project. I'm going to do a whole nother episode on Enrich because it's a really cool thing, and I think it's great for educators to know. So stay tuned on that. But here's where I have some questions, and here's where I would actually like to pick Professor Kohn's brain, because we know that all the situations that our students are individuals. All the situations that our students encounter are going to be relatively unique because we are all individuals, and that the standard curricula that we have nowadays doesn't really attend to those specific necessities now. And I understand that, and that's totally fine. And this is why teachers have those kind of those moments of like, oh, I'm not really, the course books, they never really, it's not specific enough, or it's too specific and it's not applicable for my student, etc. I get it. However, here's my issue. Since becoming I've been mentoring and teacher training for a while, and most recently I've become a CELTA tutor, and dealing with new teachers or novice teachers or teachers who are, with limited experience in the classroom and things like that. I'm not sure how much this idea is accessible to people who don't have a lot of experience in the classroom. I'm not saying that novice teachers can't do this. I think that they need to be aware of this. They need to understand ELF, possibly BELF if they're working with business English. They need to understand these principles. They need to understand that there's more to communication and being able to interact with people than just the curriculum that you see in the textbooks. I do agree with Professor Kohn in the idea that we can't just teach only to the standards, because the standard English, first of all, what is standard English? Second, okay, so we have two standard Englishes that are kind of recognized, which is received pronunciation and general American. Those are kind of recognized as the two standard Englishes at this point, but who speaks standard English? I certainly don't. I grew up in the Northeast region of the U.S., and I certainly don't speak standard English. So I understand the movement away from you have to strictly adhere to this because this is the only way, to a more individualistic view of, well, this is how English actually happens day to day. And because if we're learning new languages, like I'm a learner of Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and so I have an accent. That's part of my identity because I'm not a native speaker of Brazilian Portuguese. So I have an accent, and my construction and the way that I develop things is a little atypical, we could say, because I'm still learning the language. I'm still trying to understand it. I'm still trying to interact with it. And I'm trying to communicate with somebody who has a different cultural background than me. And so all of these things do influence the way that we use the language. And so we can't say, well, you have to do it this way. Well, because not even native speakers, quote unquote native speakers, do it that way. I'm on board. I got it. But I also think that here, this quote talks about teacher training curricula. Now, from my limited experience, I've only been doing this for a few years in terms of teacher training, mentoring, and being a CELTA tutor. With my limited experience, people who come into teaching have lots of things that they're trying to learn and lots of things that they're trying to manage in terms of classroom mechanics, like just classroom management, procedural type of stuff, understanding how people learn. They are generally, there's a lot of candidates in official programs and mentoring programs that are unaware of things in terms of like speaking sub skills and reading sub skills. And they're just unaware of it, not to their own fault. They're moving into, a profession and they're trying to learn and become competent and proficient in what they're doing. So I understand the change in perspective, but I question whether or not, and it's something that I would actually like to have the conversation with Professor Kohn or with somebody else. I don't know. Well, I'll have to set up an episode. How do we manage those things? Because yes, we can introduce this perspective to them, but are English language teachers as practitioners going to be able to competently and effectively implement this type of perspective into their classroom when they still struggle with, or they're still becoming accustomed with, some of the general mechanics and the understanding of how languages are learned? And so this is where I struggle back and forth, because I work with these people and I understand their difficulty in trying to understand why we have procedures for some things. Why? Because it helps our learners. At the end of the day, if we're telling practitioners who are unfamiliar or uncomfortable with a lot of these ideas, and it's something that they're not really able to competently and effectively experiment with in their own classrooms, to what detriment are we willing to allow them to do that and have problems with students? So this is where I always have my conflict between theory and practice, because theory and practice, this is, and I'm not trying to say that I disagree with the perspective here. I actually wholeheartedly agree with everything that the professor was talking about, because I believe in this, and I see this as a reality for my students, and in working with other people. So yes, I get it, but I also think that people are operating at different levels and at different stages, and we go into the teaching profession because we want to help people. We want them to benefit from interacting with us. How much benefit are they going to get if practitioners can't effectively apply these types of things, because it needs to be scaffolded for them? So I always kind of struggle with this. I think I need to hash it out probably somewhere and not on this episode. But let me continue. So then there is this Enrich project, which he mentions, and excuse me, and I will be doing another episode, because I think this is one of the ways in terms of teacher education and teacher training that opens up these perspectives and gets people to understand what's going on and effectively implement it in their classrooms, because I'm always concerned about what is the consequences for our learners. Okay, so the message, going back to answering the question, Professor Kohn says that the message for teachers seems to be clear. For pedagogical orientation, beware of belt standards, English preference, and rely on the realities of general English or ELF communications. And he did say that this raises feelings of ambivalence and insecurity, because what kind of English should be taught and learned? Excuse me. And where shall we turn for our answers? And so he references Galloway again, that the purpose of ELF research is not to establish a teachable model. Priscilla has said this before. Helen Haga has said this before on the podcast here, that we're not trying to get a teachable model when we're talking about ELF or BELF, and to prescribe what should be taught in the ELT classroom. GELT, another acronym for you, so Global English's language teaching, simply requires that we consider the learner's context and their needs when thinking about the target language to include. Agreed. 100% love this quote. It's from Galloway. It's great. So then he encouraged us to look at the other side of the moon. So let's focus on speaker learners' own GE or ELF communication, and not mainly on other people's. So we can't just say, well, this is what typically what happens when we go here, when we go there, what actually happens for this person, because that might be different. So we can't necessarily, we're just trading one for the other, right? So we say, well, the course book is doing something on traveling and it doesn't attend to my client's needs. And then you create something because in your own perception, this is what they're going to need. And then what the learner is trying to tell you is, actually, this is not what I need. I need this because this is the scenario that I'm going to be encountering. So there's an important distinction between teaching and learning for comprehension and teaching and learning for production. So when we are teaching and learning for comprehension, the communicative exposure of a wide variety of Englishes is important, but that might not be the case, that they might have to have communicative exposure of a wide variety for production. So there was kind of like a question mark there. So he quotes Sittelhofer again in arguing for a shift in perspective. So what really matters is that the language taught for production should engage the learner's reality and activate the learning process. Again, I agree. This is why when you sit with your students and say, okay, so what do you, when you're doing your needs analysis, and you say, what do you have to do? And they say, well, I have to give presentations. You can't give the same classes to every student on presentations. It doesn't work like that, because the dynamics, the content, the hierarchical structure within the organization who are attending those, I mean, there's so many other factors that you can't say, well, I have the perfect class for business presentations. I'm going to say wrong. I say you might have a really good class that is applicable for many students about business presentations, but it's not going to fit all needs. So then he talks about how we acquire our English repertoires. From a social constructivist perspective, speaker learners acquire the English taught by creating their own version of it in their minds, hearts, and behavior. Through communication practices and cooperation with others, influenced by individual and social dispositions and forces, and guided by their personal requirements of communicative and communal success. So he coins the term of my English, meaning my language, my being capital. The translingual repertoire is ranging from standard to casual to boldly creative. It's not a pedagogical option, but part of a human condition for learning. I agree to an extent. Here's a side note on this, and I again, didn't have a chance to talk about it with Professor Kohn. He's giving a presentation, so obviously you can't go in depth into everything. So that, anyways, here's my side note to that. Okay, yes, students need to create their own version of their English, my English, right? By creating their own version through interactions and based on their own requirements of success. I get that. But here's my question. To what extent do we have to teach the quote-unquote standard, or at least give them foundational information for them to then be able to creatively develop their own version? See, this is where the idea I love, but in practicality, I'm going to sit there and say, well, okay, I want them to create their own English. I think it's an expression of their identity. I think that, when I express myself in Portuguese, it's an expression of my identity, and you can clearly see that I come from a different cultural background, and I'm using the language in a way that I think is most appropriate to express my feelings. That yes, I have my Portuguese. It's not standard, but it's mine, right? But I did have to have a bit of information, a bit of input, of standard. This is what happens. And then I was able to say, okay, so this is standard. How can I make that mine? Like how can I create that, to create and develop a way of speaking that is mine, that's individualized, and that makes sense for me, and that still works with intelligibility, still works with communicative practices, and still, I'm successful in being a part of the community. But I still needed to have that foundational information. I still needed to create the repertoire. Creating the repertoire, for me, still, unless somebody, can change my mind, would have to be based on some sort of standard. Because to be able to creatively manipulate it, you have to have the standard. So, yes and no. So, I agree with the opinion. I agree with the idea of my English, my language. I agree with that the whole train of thought here. But how do we differentiate that? So, for example, we have the foundational repertoire that we need to give to students. What is that based on? It can't be based on creative options. It has to be based on some sort of standard. This is the standard. This is what people will understand. And then you can get creative with it. Because I don't think that you can use something that's already creative or outside of the standard and then further change that, because it will be so far removed from the original that it could interfere with intelligibility. So I still think we have to hash that out a little bit. So implications for my English for teaching this way, or any other language too, by the way, he mentioned that it's necessary to change the BELT or ELT approach. So from a strict quasi-behavioristic copying, cloning, target language orientation to an open social constructivist orientation with room for speaker learners to make the English taught their own, to trust their creativity or creative agency as emancipated non-native speakers of English, to aim for speaker satisfaction guided by their personal requirements of communicative communal success. Students need to be taken serious as agents of their own learning. and he pretty much is wrapping up that he wants, the problem with BELT is not its orientation towards standard English. The problem is that what speaker learners are allowed, encouraged, and supported to do with this orientation. So teaching for learning, and learning is always more than simply picking up what is taught. I agree. I got it, but I also, because I understand that we can't have necessarily behavioristic copying, cloning. We don't like the idea of drilling. We don't like the idea, because, okay, that's fine. Though it works. I mean, audio-lingual practices are still around for years, and there's a reason. I mean, we can go back and forth and debate everything. But it's clear to me, because it says to make the English taught their own, but we still have to teach something. And so we still have to teach a standard, and then they can make it their own. I'm okay with that. That's fine. But there still has to be some sort of standardization, because if we say, well, you can respond however you want, and I don't think that is what Professor Kohn is saying. But this is sometimes the misinterpretation when people see these things. Oh, well, I should be allowed to, the student should respond. This is their identity. Yes and no. There has to be some sort of standard that the creative responses and the creative development of expression comes off of. Because if we don't have a standard, then it's just opening doors for misinterpretation. It's opening doors for lack of intelligibility. It's opening doors for miscommunication. So while I agree, I also still firmly believe that we have to have some sort of standard to be able to work off of. And what that balance is and what that represents in your classroom, I think that's kind of up to you. So if you have, well, I choose to teach to a specific standard the language for this type of lesson, and then afterwards I allow them to creatively express themselves and to manipulate the language. I think that we're just kind of looking for what's the balance, because they need to have the repertoire, in my opinion, in my perspective, the repertoire comes from some sort of standard, and then it moves into creative and you can, manipulate the language however you want. So then there's the third question. Whew, this is going to be a long episode, guys. Sorry. It was really, this is what happens when you go for like CPD stuff and it's really interesting questions. The third question is, how can speaker learners develop their agency and emancipation so as to be able to make best BELF use of their BELT English repertoire and their communicative capability? Sorry. So to answer that, he talks about an immersive pedagogical lingua franca approach as ELF extension of communicative language teaching. Meaning that BELT students of different linguocultural backgrounds communicate with each other using their my language repertoires as a pedagogical lingua franca. So there's a preferred implementation in blended learning environments. So there's intercultural virtual exchange, meaning pretty much setting up these really cool, interesting and interactive ways of having people from different cultures interact with each other. And he gave some examples like preparation of follow-up class, video conferencing, blah, 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 blah. Small group discussions, things like that. And then there was pedagogical monitoring before, during, and after. So there's organizations of the technologies. It's pretty much having you as a practitioner facilitate intercultural exchanges so that the students can then experiment with their My English repertoires. And from the perspective that you're going to be more of the focus as a pedagogical lingua franca model. So, yeah. So he has actually created this Tecola, I think that's how he pronounced it, TECOLA project. And I'll put the link in the show notes for you. It's a intercultural pedagogical lingua franca interactions across Europe between secondary school students using digital walls like Padlet, video communications, and they have a virtual world. So it's actually quite cool. So if you're interested in starting to implement this type of perspective that, students need to be able to use their repertoires to create their English and communicate with students around the world and that type of thing. I highly recommend taking a look at the Tecola project. It's a wonderful, I looked at it during the presentation, and it's got tons of resources and all sorts of really cool stuff there. So it's definitely something that you can check out and see if you can start integrating it. I also would thank Professor Kohn because I really enjoyed the talk and I got a lot from it. I also think that I have some questions though, so I'd love to have him on the podcast to kind of like narrow it down, because I'm someone who lives in the very practical. And so while I love the idea of all of these things and I agree with it, I see it happening with my students. I'm going to do a case study to follow up with this one, because there are these surprises that help happen in the BELF environment and all of that type of stuff. I think to myself, oh, good. The car is driving by, of course, for selling eggs. So now the podcast is official. It's officially a Real Talk and ELT podcast. So I like all of these ideas, but because I live in such practicality sometimes, I wonder where we strike the balance. I wonder where we say, okay, here's a good balance or a good percentage, or I don't know if we can even narrow it down to, quantifiable numbers or anything like that. But how do we find the balance between building the students' repertoire, building their foundation, giving them enough tools and resources to be proficient and to be good communicators, skills and language and all of that stuff, and balance that with this perspective of giving them agency and emancipation, with being able to creatively use what they have to express themselves and express their individuality. Where does that balance lie? So That's it for this episode. Stay tuned. There's going to be some connected episodes to this if you're interested in following. I do have a case study, like I said, and I will be digging into the Enrich project, which is a wonderful project, especially if you're looking for a little something that you can do on your own for kind of self-study CPD. Just, refreshing and getting some new information and reflecting on some perspectives. So stay tuned for those episodes, and I will see you later.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk and ELT. Want to join the conversation? Head on over to Instagram at Kelly Pennington ELT and send me a message. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube or Spotify channel to stay up to date. And of course, take care of yourself, your health, your vibe, and your tribe. Until next time.